Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hannah Lanigan, and I'm responsible business advocacy manager at TSB. A little bit of context for why we're running this session today. TSB are a proud early adopter of the Good Business Charter, and we were the first high street bank to be accredited in 2020. And this fortnight, they celebrate their 5-year anniversary and as part of that, we're pleased to be their business champion for Employee Representation Thursday, which is today, alongside the Trade Union Congress, who we're joined by today as well. So I'll hand over to Jenny Herrera, who's a Good Business Charter CEO, to hear a little bit more about what they do and how they're celebrating this week and next.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you join us. It's an exciting fortnight for us at the Good Business Charter. It is Good Business Fortnight, which started on Monday and really is a national campaign because we're all a bit tired about hearing about all the bad business behaviour, all the scandals that we read about in the newspapers. So we really think it's important to just pause and champion all the good stuff that's going on, all the different things that businesses are doing that are just great practice and things that we can learn from one another. And so we have taken this fortnight, which, as Hannah said, is also around our 5th anniversary. So we launched in 2020 with the TUC and CBI as partners who helped us develop the Good Business Charter, which is a national accreditation over 10 components. And we've made it to 5 years and we're excited to mark that and really keep raising public awareness. So yeah, Good Business Fortnight, it's an awareness week really to celebrate the outstanding effects of businesses across the UK in championing responsible business practices. So we're in week 1. We started with Responsible Business Monday because we think it's really important to just talk about the whole framework of the Good Business Charter as one. And then we've taken a day for each of our 10 components. We've brought fair hours and fair pay together tomorrow in Fair Pay and Hours Friday. But this enables us to look at each day and think, okay, why does this matter? Why is it part of the Good Business Charter? What can we learn in this area? So today, as Hannah said, is Employee Representation Thursday, which we have on the next slide. And for each of these days, we've asked an organisation that is one of our accredited organisations to really lead the way, and we have been delighted to have TSB lead the way for us on this component. And just it's a great opportunity to look about these strategic partnerships with unions. And of course, our founder partner TUC has come alongside to be our component partner. We're also delighted to have today Ged from Accord, which is the union that TSB specifically work with. And I think it's going to be a really fascinating hour as we listen to all 3 speakers share. Then I'm going to be leading through the questions. Employee representation is about empowering all employees to have a voice. And I don't know what size your business is as you join us on this call, but whatever size your business is, whatever sector it's in, there needs to be a way that employees can be heard. And we're going to look at the kind of role that unions play in that. So the final slide, which when they go out to you, just gives a bit of extra information about the Good Business Charter. I would encourage you to have a look. If you're not already accredited, it would be a great opportunity to have a look and see if this would work for you as a really clear way to explain to your customers, your suppliers, your workforce in particular, that you are really standing up for good business behaviour and this is how you're doing it. So I am going to hand over to our first speaker. Well, let me just tell you who our panel speakers are first. So we've got Kate Bell, who is Assistant General Secretary at the TUC. We have Ged Nichols, General Secretary at Accord, and Ariam Enraght-Moony, who's a Chief People Officer at TSB. So each one's going to speak in turn, and I'm going to first of all hand over to Kate.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks to Hannah for the introduction. Just in case anyone on the call doesn't know what the TUC is, we're the Trades Union Congress, and we bring together 48 trade unions who represent over 5 million workers, and that's across a huge range of sectors, from acting to manufacturing to finance, as we've got colleagues here today. So we try to coordinate their voices and stand up for working people across the board. Big thanks to the Good Business Charter for the work you're doing to promote better, more responsible business, and we're really happy to be part of that. And I think my job is really just to be a bit of a scene setter, really. I'm going to talk a bit about the benefits to businesses and to workers about strategic engagement with unions. And I really want to focus on why that strong worker voice is important and representation, that independent worker voice, which is what trade unions provide, and maybe give you a couple of examples of where we think that's really working. I think it's a really timely moment to be having this discussion. The government's employment rights bill is going through Parliament, and a big focus of that is on strengthening the possibility for workers to have an independent voice in their workplace. We've got that big focus from the government as well on growth and productivity, and we think that independent workplace voice can be part of that agenda. We think when you listen to your workers, your business performs better, and that's part of that agenda there. And of course, we've got another big discussion happening in the business world around the role of tech. What do we think of AI? What does it mean for jobs? And again, we've done quite a lot of work showing that if you talk to your workers about when you're introducing new technology into a workplace, it's most likely to be implemented effectively. So I think those big kind of things which are on the national agenda, which I'm sure are on businesses' agendas, are really relevant to today's conversation. So starting maybe with that kind of employment rights bill, that bill introduces, it's going through Parliament at the moment, it's had most of its stage in the House of Commons, and we think the aim of that bill is really about improving industrial relations in the UK. It's an agenda about making work pay, but it is also that agenda around giving workers an independent voice. We think it's good for workers, we think it's good for businesses, and we think it should be good for our economy. And we know that in mainstream international practice, many of you may have operated businesses in Europe, you may have international businesses, is some of these changes that are being brought in by the Employment Rights Bill are really very widespread across many of our competitive countries. Those changes like banning exploitative zero-hours contracts are changes which also enable those good businesses who want to compete on a high-skill, high-productivity model, not to be undercut, not to be competing on price with businesses who only want to compete on trying to drive down conditions for workers. So it's really about ensuring that decent majority of employers can't be undercut by the minority of bad bosses. Those specific changes around giving unions a stronger voice, so new rights for unions to access a workplace, to tell people about the benefits of joining a trade union, and some simplifications in the process of gaining recognition. So that's when the company agrees to collectively negotiate with its workforce and with an independent trade union. Just to reiterate that point, we think this is about improving industrial relations, giving those mechanisms to solve disputes where they arise, to talk about the issues which are affecting a workforce right across the industry, and to give workers that independent voice. Now, some of this has been controversial. We've seen some pushback from some of the larger business organisations, but we've been polling kind of small and medium-sized firms, we've been polling managers, and we found kind of support in the kind of 70% levels. We're finding that when you talk to people who are actually responsible for managing the day-to-day business relations, who are responsible for managing people, there's really strong support. And they're telling us that that idea of competing on a model of high skills, high productivity should lead to better employee retention. They think it will lead to higher productivity. Big issue at the moment, workplace health. They think when you give your workers a voice in the workplace, you should see those health improvements too. We've calculated some economic benefits. The government's got a big impact assessment. We think that some of those benefits could be up to around £13 billion a year. And again, we do see across Europe that stronger rights for workers don't have to be traded off with a stronger business sector, a stronger economy that delivers better living standards. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this in the press, but when we talk to many of the businesses who recognise unions, and brilliant that we're about to hear, of course, from TSB here, there are many businesses that recognise unions and are really talking about that productive relationship. Disputes make the news. No one is really interested in writing up great negotiation led to consensus agreement about how to introduce productivity improvements into the business. But when we actually get to listen to those businesses who do recognise unions and have that cooperative relationship, that's what they say. So we've recently had, there's a select committee inquiry going on about that employment rights bill. And I thought I'd just give you a couple of quotes from that, from some of the kind of really big businesses who've appeared in front of that. They recently had the Employee Relations Director of BAE Systems, obviously a pretty strategic company in the UK. And he said, we recognise unions very widely and we see those relationships as a real asset for our business. We work collaboratively with those unions to drive forward the success of the business and to continuously improve the workplace experience with regard to the quality of terms and conditions. We have daily interactions with the trade union and very regular business sharing at a depth that surprises most people that come to view us. Our relationship is based on trust. Big strategic company for the UK really selling that. And we heard from Jaguar Land Rover, very similar messages there too. Obviously, manufacturing is where most people imagine unions to be when they think of kind of those traditional sectors of the economy. But of course, finance, while unionised is recognised today, in retail, Tesco has a partnership agreement with unions. The West End is very highly unionised. So right across sectors of the economy, we see those productive relationships delivering for workers and delivering businesses too. And I guess our message is that good employers and employers who want to be doing well can really benefit from that independent collective voice that a trade union gives their workers. I guess this really is, that's the main point I'm trying to make. We think this really is a win agenda. We know that partnership working, and I'm sure Ged will talk about this, has helped Accord make progress on its long-term priorities, secure jobs, better rewards and dignity and equality. And when we are thinking about those big challenges, which all businesses are facing, they're cross-economy, whether that's the challenges of transitioning to net zero and a low carbon model of working, whether it is those challenges of dealing with new technology, and really looking forward to hearing if the other speakers touch on that. These are challenges which have to be discussed with the workforce, because it will ultimately be the workforce. If you want to introduce new AI into your business, it's going to be your workforce who's implementing it, who's working out, actually, it doesn't make any sense here. Actually, here's some of the kind of pernicious effects. Here's where I actually think I can start really running with this and delivering those productivity improvements. And we actually know that the evidence does say that unions are not a barrier to innovation of that sort. They're more likely to deliver more innovative practices and to build more resilient and flexible workplaces. And when workers have that independent voice, the evidence shows there's less anxiety about making change in a business, there's greater employee engagement, and there's a higher likelihood of high performance work practices being adopted. We've known this for quite a long time. It's a famous quote or kind of stat that Henry Ford doubled his workers' wages back in 1914. He said that was going to lead to higher productivity and went on to become one of the most successful car companies that century. But we've seen that in more recent times too. And I just thought I'd finish with a kind of quote from someone who was a real skeptic to the union agenda and turned round. And that was the boss of Ryanair, Michael O'Leary. Several years ago, Michael O'Leary said that hell would freeze over before he recognised a trade union. And the ITUC, that's the International Trade Union Congress, our kind of international sisters and brothers, crowned him the world's worst boss back in 2018. Eventually, his unions did force a recognition deal. And last year, he told the Wall Street Journal, I was the most anti-union boss for the first 30 years in the history of this company. I now fully accept that being unionised is a better way of dealing with that number of employees. So if I leave you with one message, it's that if Michael O'Leary can see the light, we think anybody can. But I hope that's been a good introduction to why we think employee representation is so important and the positive benefits it can deliver for businesses as well as workers. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. That is a great quote. I'm going to now hand over to Ariam and looking forward to hearing TSB's perspective.
Excellent. I couldn't agree with you more. Quotes from BAE Systems as well really resonated. So anyway, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me, and hello. I say, if I talk about my own experience at TSB and how we think about our unions, like we feel it's important as a business to have a credible union representation. As an executive, we accept that there'll be times when we have to undertake initiatives that will create concern or uncertainty for our colleagues, and the constructive relationship that we've established with our unions means that we can achieve our aims while the unions challenge us and help identify ways that we can execute necessary changes with fairness and integrity to meet the ever-changing needs and demands of our customers, to stay relevant and grow a sustainable business, which means that we have a home for the colleagues that continue to sustain that business. The unions have a huge role to play in ensuring that our greatest assets, our colleagues, are centered in our decision-making as an executive. And in turn, they also play a role in engaging our colleagues in the evolution of the business. I think, Ged and I have often talked about the fact that we have a skills focus as we face into a complex world in which AI has a growing role to play. How do we evolve the skills and capabilities of our colleagues in order to keep them relevant and keep our business efficient and relevant as well? So there's a lot of alignment in terms of the outcomes that both sides of the discussion really face into. The reality is, though, the work is done in the informal interactions. Of course, we have formal agreements in place in the areas where unions have a right to formal consultation. However, we meet both of our recognized unions every 2 weeks and discuss topics where we have identified areas of mutual interest. And the TSB CEO, Robin Bullock, and I attended the Accord Union Conference in 2024. That was a first for me up in Glasgow. And it was an education and frankly, really gratifying to hear our union reps discuss topics which are important to our colleagues, share and take ideas from the practices of other businesses. Our unions help to inform us where there are issues or opportunities which may influence our strategy, as well as local issues that require management intervention. We've taken on board quite a lot of those ideas, and it's helped us meet the needs of our colleagues and again, engage and really challenge ourselves, but engage our colleagues more deeply in our business and be more committed. And as you mentioned, helps the retention and conviction with which they serve our customers. So Ged and I don't ever discuss tea and toilets. We're usually busy discussing socialism and the future of AI, but really the whole relationship, as you mentioned, is really built on trust and transparency. We always make a point of sharing both the palatable and the unpalatable so that there are no surprises. I think that's fundamental. We engage early, face into our challenges. We're transparent and collaborative in our conversations, and it helps both sides. It really is an opportunity for us to think creatively and differently about solving common problems. And so far, that's consistently served us well, whether it's dealing with our stakeholders, our colleagues, or our unions. It's one that I would lean into. So that's what I wanted to share from my experience and how we operate at TSB and our partnership with our recognized unions.
Thank you. We're going to pass on to Ged. You're all being super short, which means we're going to have time for questions. So over to you, Ged.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm delighted to be involved in this. Picking up the reference to Michael O'Leary, once described as the unacceptable face of capitalism. I think the cuddly face of trade unionism in this context. I'm talking about the benefits of positive engagement, high trust and meaningful relationships. And it's easy to think about industrial relations, as Kate said, about the stuff that makes headlines, which is when industrial relations breaks down. And all of the good work that goes on all of the time is not very newsworthy. I sometimes talk about industrial relations like any other relationship. If you spend all your time shouting at each other, nobody's listening. And it's not a way to have a healthy, happy, enduring relationship and make sure that things get done. So the engagement that Ariam referred to about understanding the business's strategy, understanding that we've got a shared interest as the business needs to be successful if it's going to be able to give people secure jobs, rewarding careers, good pay, and deal with all the other parts of the softer HR industrial relations agenda that are so important to people at work and differentiate good, responsible businesses from others. I think that we trade union leaders generally haven't got horns. I've spent a long time in the finance sector engaging with TSB and with us, understanding the business is a really important part of what unions do, because, as I say, we've got a vested interest in the business succeeding, but succeeding in taking its workforce with it and recognising the legitimate interests of the workforce as voiced through their trade unions. And I think that unions have a challenge in the modern age, when there's so many voices and different ways of people expressing their views, to ensure that we're acting responsibly, that we're communicating well with members, that we're just not articulating the most negative view all of the time. We are also educating members to some of the issues and conflicts and challenges that businesses are trying to face into, because it'd be lovely if we got everything that we want. We don't, not very often anyway. But then that's the art of negotiation, of compromise, of reaching agreements, of sticking to them. I think it's really important as well that, again, in the modern media age, that we act very responsibly in relation to the press and social media. And the last thing that we want to do, particularly if an employer we're working with has got a difficult issue, is to make that even more difficult by commenting to the press or on social media in ways which might be helpful for point scoring if that was important. But then we know that at the customer interface, whether that's on the telephone or in a bank branch, the members of the public can bring those things out with employees in a sometimes not very pleasant way. And we don't want to create problems between the workforce and their customers. It's difficult enough, the job that people have to do on the front line. I believe in long-term trusting relationships. We have dealt with some very difficult things over time, not calling out TSB in particular, but there's been challenges, everything through the financial crisis, COVID clearly, which I think for many employers was a high watermark in employee trust, where people saw how well the employers, particularly unionised employers who worked well with unions, responded to that. Then you get some new challenges about people who got used to working from home and don't like going to the office anymore. And there's lots of issues about hybrid working, compressed working. What does the modern workplace look like post-COVID? And I think there's some really interesting stuff that unions and companies have to work together on to get our heads around how we're going to continue that engagement with a workforce when the traditional workplace isn't something that people are experiencing all of the time, and sometimes none of the time. Working with good employers like TSB is an absolute pleasure, but we still have our differences from time to time. We don't always agree. And I think a key to the relationship is how you understand, if you understand that you're not always going to agree, how you create a process for resolving disagreements that doesn't end up in disputes. And that way, you're free to disagree, you're free to hold your ground, because you're not going to necessarily escalate that into a dispute if there's another way of resolving it. And sometimes having the workforce aware of different positions, but nevertheless there's a difference of opinion, but we'll continue to move together in a certain direction. So that's my opening remarks, which I hope will chime with those of you who are on the call, because as members of the Responsible Business Partnership, I know that you're more likely to be in this headspace as opposed to another one. But I'll be happy to participate in the questions and answers when we get there.
Thank you, Ged, and thank you for that openness, that you don't always agree. This is all about that transparency. And for me, when I hear you talking about how too often we just hear about the disputes and none of the good practice, it just underlines why we're having Good Business Fortnight. That's the point, isn't it? We need to be able to have an opportunity to share more of good practices that are going on up and down the country. So we're going to move into a time of questions. I'm going to ask one to you all, and then I've got some specific questions, a specific question for each of you, and then we'll be able to head out to the audience. So do keep those questions coming in, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a few of them. So first of all, we've heard the term social partnership in the past to describe the relationship between unions, businesses and the government. It'd be useful to hear your organisation's take on social partnership. So if I can come to you first, Kate.
So it's a really interesting one. So social partnership, I think, was embedded in some of our legislation that came from the EU actually, and we normally think of that as happening at a government level, basically. So it's where government will formally consult people representing workers' interests and people representing business interests. The main social partnership organisation we've got in the UK is the Low Pay Commission, which I was lucky enough to represent the TUC on for a while. And what the Low Pay Commission does is make a recommendation to government each year on the level of the national living wage and the youth rates that sit under that. It does that by a process of negotiation. So it's appointed by government. There's 3 worker representatives, 3 employer representatives, and 3 independent people who are generally academics. And they take evidence throughout the year and then they negotiate a recommendation to government on what the level of the national living wage is. So that's the kind of most classic social partnership arrangement we've got in the UK. Our still newish government is, I think, experimenting with a few more forms of social partnership. So this isn't meant to be all about me, but it's obviously what's in my head. But I'm on the government's Industrial Strategy Council, which is set up recently to think about driving forward those growth sectors. We have union representatives on the board of the new Skills England body, which is going to be thinking about the skills sectors. There's a Net Zero Council, which government has set up to think about how we get there. And I guess the aim of it is making sure that when government's making those big decisions, which we all know affect workers, they affect businesses, they affect all of our working lives, there's a way for workers to have their voices fed in, and there's a way for employers to have their voices fed in as well. So that's what we think of as social partnership. As I say, in many countries, it's embedded formally into their legislative systems. At the EU level, it's also embedded formally, those representative structures. Biggest one we've got is the Low Pay Commission, but I think the government is taking steps in that direction. One really tiny thing I meant to add was furlough is probably the most recent example we've had where actually during the pandemic, Ged mentioned the pandemic, you might remember in Rishi Sunak's speech when he introduced furlough, a sort of vivid time in most people's memory, I think, that early pandemic days, he thanked the TUC and he thanked the CBI, basically. So he said very explicitly, I've been happy to work with the TUC and the CBI in setting up that scheme. And we would actually say, hold that up as a good example of where government did consult with workers' representatives, did consult with business in the setting up of that scheme and the extending of it over time.
If we come over to you, Ariam.
Sure. Look, if I think about social partnership for TSB, it really features in one of the 4 pillars of our strategy, which we call Do What Matters plan. And so for that's published, and where we feel we've published our meaningful, sustainable commitments externally. So it's one that we hold ourselves accountable for. There are key areas where we recognize as being of particular importance to people. And there are examples I'll share with you where I feel like TSB has had a real opportunity and taken market leading positions and had influence far bigger than our scale and size in terms of impacting the wider society, where regulation or legislation has actually followed. I'll speak about firstly the issue of fraud. Since 2020, TSB has been refunding victims of our own customers who've been victimized by fraud to the tune of upwards of 95% of fraud victims among our customers. And that's now something that's been extended across the UK banking sector through regulation. Some of our competitors, were refunding up to 50%. Like I said, we were in excess of 95%. So it was a real big push for us. We lobbied, we worked with government to really influence that change in the wider market, recognizing the growing risks and the impact that fraud was having on banking customers across the UK and elsewhere. The other point of pride is the impact we've had in terms of a response to domestic abuse. So TSB has been offering a physical safe space in our branch network and an emergency flea fund to customers, giving customers who are in a desperate state in terms of fleeing a domestic abuse situation, who have been victims, giving them a startup fund, allowing them to escape their circumstances and start a new life. And so that's something that we have had in place and subsequently has been adopted by the government in the UK and in Wales. And finally, I'll talk about the carers, and we've been partnering with Carers UK to lobby and campaign for paid carers leave. You'll know that in April last year, the government legislated 10 days of unpaid carers leave as a right. We've had that in place since 2020 at TSB, but we since 2020 have had paid carers leave, and we think that's a big difference in terms of allowing people to actually take advantage of this right and maintain their financial security. So we offer 70 hours of paid carers leave, as well as other benefits, which include a fully funded Care Hero concierge service, which provides all manner of logistical and personalized support for carers in our workforce. And the reality is all of these things have a profound impact on how our customers see us as a brand, as a bank, but also has a profound impact by virtue of impacting legislation for the whole of the UK society. Regardless of the fact that we're not a particularly large bank, we do use our platform and voice to influence the wider society, and in that partnership, working closely with the third sector as well as government partners. The TSB executive is committed to demonstrating that we are an organization that cares about our people, our customers, our colleagues in the moments that matter. And the benefit of that is clear for the organization. We've proven that. We have an enhanced employee engagement. We have reduced employee turnover, and that's actually a massive asset for the strength of our business. It's a win.
Okay, so that question then to Ged.
I mentioned the one that I was going to mention as an example of social partnership in practice. I was actually president of the TUC at the time that our then General Secretary, Francis O'Grady, stood on the steps of Downing Street for a photo op with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, having just lobbied effectively for the introduction of a furlough scheme. And it was actually the TUC's idea, and that made a massive beneficial impact on millions of working people in the UK, many of whom not union members, of course. And that I think was superb, and it demonstrated against the popular perception that the trade unions can work effectively with a Conservative government. I was very pleased with that work. It was somewhat a shame because, again, as president of the TUC at the time, I was involved with some of the conversations with the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson about it. But when there was a change in Labour's leadership, the warmth that and engagement we'd had from the then government dried up for their own political reasons. And I think that was a pity, because the progress that had been made on social partnership there could have continued along non-partisan lines. And whilst some of the biggest unions in the UK are affiliated to political parties, many others aren't. Accord has no party political affiliations, and all unions have a duty on behalf of their members to deal with the government of the day, whoever that government happens to be. But a couple of other examples I was going to mention now. The Health and Safety Executive, of course, is a tripartite body. On the board of the HSE, we have employee representatives as well as employer representatives and independents. It's an arm's length body from the Department of Work and Pensions. For my sins, I'm one of the directors of the HSE from the employee side. But I was also going to give a really good example that's current, which is the work that's going on between the Shop Workers Union, USDOR, and the British Retail Consortium about violence against shop workers. And we include bank workers in that definition, hopefully. But there's a common societal problem. And rather than the unions blaming the employers for the incidents or taking a more adversarial approach, they've been working together with government to say, what could we do about this? So I think that's a really good, positive example. Sad that it's necessary, but of social partnership in practice. We, in Accord, we'd have some engagement with regulators from time to time. Others, I remember, and KFI was the government body holding the shares in some of the UK's banks after the financial crisis, when the government had to take stakes in some of the banks. That was a time when, we might identify issues on which we jointly wanted to lobby to give the banks the freedom to do some of the things for the employers. That, as a shareholder and trying to change some of the culture of banking, some of the things that UKFI wanted the banks to do didn't necessarily meet with the agenda of employees at the time. There's lots of examples of social partnership when you go looking for them, and mainly very positive. Sorry, my cat decided he's going to make himself present on this Zoom call, which is hopefully he's gone away.
Great, thank you. So Kate, do unions and employers have the skills and capacity to cope with any increase in collective bargaining that comes as a result of the government's Make Work Pay agenda?
I think we have the skills, definitely. The capacity is something we need to build, and we're spending quite a lot of time in the TUC with our unions thinking about if this is more opportunity for working with business, if it is more opportunity for union recognition, how do we build the skills and capacity across our movement? How do we make the best use of new digital tools to do that, to be efficient ourselves in our ways of working? How do we train the organisers? How do we train the kind of union representatives? Because obviously it's worth remembering that union representatives are volunteers in their workplace, basically. How do we train them up and make sure we have the kind of skills and capacity we need? Probably not really my place to sort of advocate for the sort of business side or to assess their level of capacity, but I think one thing we are really conscious of is we have various kind of advisory organisations. We've got ACAS, we have some enforcement organisations, we've got, in the last resource, the employment tribunal system. All of those organisations have been pretty underfunded over the last decade or so. And I think we can definitely see the case for saying one of the things government should be doing right now and should be thinking about is how can they put resource into places people can go for advice. ACAS would be obviously very strongly one of those. And actually, how can they be putting some resource into the places where people go when something does go wrong, whether that's the employment tribunal system or indeed the enforcement agencies when, for example, someone's not paying the minimum wage. So I think we're thinking hard about skilling up, building up to take advantage of the new context. But I think we do think there's a role for government in providing some of that support too.
Very busy time for you. Question for you. Can you outline the wider benefits for both a union and a business that are perhaps less well known, and give some examples of where organisations and employees have benefited?
I think that the pace of technological change is something that is testing for organisations, and I think sadly we've had to deal with continued restructuring, job losses, organisations having to adapt, change shape and so on. And whilst the sometimes inevitable job reductions are never pleasant and always a challenge, there are ways in which those can be achieved that hopefully doesn't leave residual scarring on the organisation by trying to find a match between, sorry, this cat. My Greek cat is very badly behaved. Sorry. It doesn't leave a scar on the organisation, and that if the union uses its intelligence and tries to find the ground between the people that want to stay with the organisation and those that want to leave, and sometimes the unions are in a trusted space and people will share information with the union that they might not want to necessarily share directly with their employer because they feel like there might be prejudice in their position. But obviously the organisations need to retain the right people in the right places with the right skills and so on. But I think some of those difficult workforce changes where there's a union involved can go a lot more smoothly than would otherwise be the case. And whilst it's not the most satisfying part of the job to have to deal with redundancy consultation if the the context and the need for change is understood and well articulated and proven, then I think we can assist with delivery there. And again, I guess that's something that wouldn't necessarily be in people's minds when they think about what unions do. So that's an example.
Yeah, brilliant. And Ariam, as well as engaging with unions, at the Good Business Charter, we advise organisations to consider a range of methods to engage employees. For example, at Richer Sounds, they make huge use of their suggestion scheme, making sure that employees really are feeding in because they're on the shop floor. They know exactly what changes are needed. I'm interested to know how the TSB balances the need to consult with and listen to your employees, but without compromising your strategic partnership with unions.
Yeah, thank you. Look, as I mentioned earlier, the unions are central to our colleagues listening as well. So it's not only the perspective and ideas that they bring to the table, but they are reflecting and they poll their membership from time to time. And they give us a real sense of where the mood music is and how that might influence our approach to changes as we have to make them. But we use a number of additional channels as well to listen. So we have an engagement survey, which takes place every 6 months. We have a monthly call, which is a two-way dialogue. We call it the stand-up, where the executive faces into the entire organization. And much like this is a facilitated conversation where we take questions straight from colleagues across the business, no matter what the topic may be. And that allows us to, again, test the mood. What are the things on people's minds? What does that tell us about how we're communicating or anything that we can be unblocking for colleagues to do their best work? We do executive roadshows routinely throughout the year. As the executive team, we will go out and communicate our strategy, our progress, where we are, what our ambition and what our accomplishments have been, just to keep everybody on the same drumbeat, on the same page, and really connected and engaged with our purpose. The one final channel I'll share with you is we have established a representative body within the organization, and what's called the Link. There's about 28 to 30 something colleagues who have applied for this position and will hold that position for 2 years. And what they do is they act as representatives of their network and part of the organization. We have a diverse mix of colleagues that serve in this role. They meet on a monthly basis. They discuss specific topics. They generate their own agenda. And then they invite senior leaders who are accountable for those topics or those areas to have a conversation and a dialogue with them, where they share feedback, they challenge ideas, they inform and influence and shape actual design that emerges as a result of their input. It's a hugely gratifying opportunity for those colleagues who actually not only build networks, influence outcomes, and shape how the organization is run, but also have the opportunity to grow and develop their own skills. So that's a tremendous opportunity. They actually come and present to the executive committee 3 or 4 times in the year, and they also go to board and share their ideas. And that's where I love the thirst for insight from this particular body when they show up in these very senior forums, and all the board wants to do is pick their brains about, well, what does that really mean? How does that feel on the ground for you? And that's really helping those senior leaders gain perspective that they might not otherwise have access to. So hugely valuable. Most recently, they've impacted how we think about learning, and we've just been talking about evolving skills to meet the moment and keep pace with the changing external environment, making sure that our colleagues remain relevant, trying to minimize the need for redundancies as we reskill and redeploy colleagues. They've had a real voice in how we think about that. How do we make this engaging? How do we make this stick? How do we attract people to actually understand the opportunity before them and to seize that opportunity? They've had a voice in helping us really rethink how we think about performance management at TSB. They've also helped us really explore options and approaches to support vulnerable customers. So it's not just internally colleague facing, but actually how do we think about our business? How do we think about our products? How do we think about our service? Because of the mix of colleagues that contribute in this forum, we have a real opportunity to tap into the collective intelligence of our business. So that's one I'm obviously pretty proud of, but many ways in which we listen.
I think it's excellent. One of the things that we require in the Good Business Charter for the employee representation component is that the voice of employees goes right up to board. And it's interesting, some conversations I've had with larger companies are like, we've got these groups and this happens, but it's not going right to the top. And then, of course, you've got board meetings where there's no employee representative, and you're like, it just needs to, you need to connect that in. And for me, it's just really gratifying when people think, oh, okay, so that's how we can fix that and enable them to accredit with us. But it's going to make a real impact to get the voice right the way up to the board. Just some great examples as well there. Thank you. I've got a question here about young people. How can we upskill young people to be ready for work and get them to understand the work of unions? Who'd like to take that?
Obviously, education is compulsory until age 18 now, but we know for a long time that lots of people in further education that's been underinvested in. Our education system as a whole has been underinvested in, the pay of our teachers has been underinvested in, and our investment, particularly in technical education, is particularly poor in the UK. We have quite a lot of slightly circular debates in the trade union movement about should we be teaching about unions in schools, and is that how to make people join a trade union. I think there's lots of legitimate views on this. I think my personal view is it's great to learn about trade unions and their role in history, but when you really need to learn about one is when you join the workplace, basically, and you need that opportunity to know that what a trade union can do for you personally in that situation in work. And that's why we think some of the changes that are coming in the Employment Rights Bill around access to workplaces, which just means that a union representative can agree with the employer when they will go to a workplace to say, this is what a trade union is, this is what we can do for you, this is why you should join, is one of those a really important step, and one that hopefully in the sectors where young people often start their careers, whether that's hospitality, some other parts of retail, is really important to understanding what a union can actually do for them and why it might benefit for them to have that independent voice in the workplace.
I've got a lot of questions specific about unions. So another one is about any advice for a business considering union representation. What should they be looking for? Ged, do you want to unmute? I can see you answering.
Unions tend to be organised around particular sectors or industries, but when a union is starting to get members in a business, typically it'll be what we might call grievance-based organising. There's something wrong and people are contacting the union in order to seek if they can get support for some kind of challenge. And the relationship from that point of view starts on potential conflict. I think that's where companies are thinking, do you know what, it'd be quite good if our workforce was organised in a trade union and we could set up appropriate structures for consultation and negotiation and so on. And the unions are being invited in and given time and space to explain what being in a union is and to recruit members. I think you're then starting from a much more positive point of view. So I think that's, if unions are going to be in workplaces, that's a much more positive way of doing it. Management inviting the unions in. Always there'll be a bit of suspicion, perhaps, because the employees might say, why would we be in the union that the bosses like? If they don't get it, if they just think that the union is there to deal with conflict. And the TUC has a clearinghouse, I'll call it, where you can contact the TUC and they would let you know who's the most appropriate union for your sector and give you contact details of people to talk to. And that's a good starting point for anybody.
Brilliant. Sounds good to me. Get in contact with Kate and she'll point you to the right person. No, the TUC will be able to hopefully give you some guidance there. We can't have a conversation about trade unions without the topic of strikes. So as we come into land, there's been a sharp increase in strike action in the last few years. It's a last resort tactic, but it does have a significant impact on businesses and individuals. What can unions and employers do to prevent more strikes, particularly in an environment when the government appears keen to remove barriers to industrial action?
Shall I kick off on that one? Talk to each other is the really simple answer. I think one thing that was very notable in the big wave of strikes we had in the public sector, not last year, but the year before, was for the longest time, government would just not talk to unions. So before the strike started, once it became clear that pay offers were going to be lower than members' expectations, unions were saying, please can we have a discussion with you? Please can we talk to you about this? We want to find a way through, we want negotiations. And government were very much started off in the position of, no, we don't talk to you, that's the offer. That's what it is, there is no way for moving, and a kind of tough guy approach, basically. Unions want to negotiate, they want to deliver for their members. Taking their members out on strike, which means members lose pay, is not what most people's sign of success is. What is delivering is showing that the employer has listened, has moved. Every employer will have hard lines that they can't move, but in pretty much every situation there is a deal to be had, and it's better to get to that deal faster, quicker. That's done by talking, rather than to wind up your employees to the extent to which they feel they have to walk out, because the end result of that is also going to probably be a deal. So get to the deal quicker, start talking, be flexible, be creative. Unions want to do deals, most employers do too.
Well, that was a fabulous answer, and I'm very conscious of time, so I think we will end on that positive. I hope this has been a really helpful webinar for you, just a sense really of the importance of trust, the importance of talking to one another and trying to negotiate these things, and just the benefits for TSB as a case study really in point of how working with unions has really benefited them. So I really want to thank our speakers today, Kate, Ged, Ariam, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who's joined us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye-bye.